What began as another stop on the North American hardcourt swing suddenly became something much bigger. The crowds were louder. The Philippine flags were everywhere. Fans were traveling hundreds of miles, rearranging their lives, organizing reunions, and paying hundreds of dollars just for the chance to watch one young player walk onto a tennis court. That player was Alex Eala. And according to ESPN, the tennis world was finally putting a name to what fans had been witnessing all summer: the Eala effect. Alex Eala had not simply arrived in Cincinnati to play tennis. She had arrived with an entire community behind her. A 21-year-old Filipina had transformed her matches into events. Her supporters were not behaving like casual spectators. They were organizing trips around her schedule, driving for hours between tournaments, filling stadiums with Philippine flags, inventing jokes and traditions around her game, and creating an atmosphere so unusual that even experienced players and commentators were taking notice. And now, one of the biggest sports networks in the world was documenting it. ESPN highlighted Eala's extraordinary popularity and emphasized that her importance extends beyond her results on court. The network pointed toward something potentially even more significant: Eala's ability to introduce a new generation of young Filipinos to tennis. That is what makes this story bigger than Cincinnati. Because Alex Eala is no longer simply trying to establish herself as a professional tennis player. She is becoming a cultural phenomenon. And the tennis establishment is beginning to realize just how powerful that can be. Cincinnati was supposed to be another tournament on paper. Cincinnati was simply another major event on Eala's increasingly impressive 2026 schedule. She entered the Cincinnati Open as the number 17 seed, the highest seeding of her career at a WTA 1000 tournament. Her North American hardcourt record was already attracting serious attention. Heading into Cincinnati, she had won 8 of her previous 9 matches, including her breakthrough WTA title in Washington and a strong run at the National Bank Open in Toronto. The tennis results alone were enough to make her one of the players to watch. But something else was happening. Everywhere Eala went, her supporters followed. And they were not simply following her online. They were following her physically. They were buying tickets. They were traveling between cities. They were waving Philippine flags. They were bringing their families. They were staying up late. They were turning tennis matches into celebrations of Filipino identity. That was the part of the story that made Cincinnati different. The tournament was not just hosting Alex Eala. It was hosting Alex Eala's community. And that community was getting harder and harder to ignore. ESPN finally put it into perspective. Eala's second-round victory over Elena Gabriela Ruse provided another reminder of why she had become such a major story. Eala dominated the opening exchanges, winning an impressive percentage of points against Ruse's first serve and an even higher percentage against her second serve. She eventually won 6-1, 3-0 before Ruse retired because of a right foot injury. It was Eala's 8th victory in 9 matches. But the scoreboard was only part of ESPN's story. The network focused heavily on the phenomenon surrounding Eala. That distinction matters. Tennis is full of talented young players. Every season produces new winners, new rankings breakthroughs, and new potential stars. But very few players create the kind of demand Eala was creating. ESPN highlighted the importance of Eala beyond the court and specifically discussed the potential for her success to bring young Filipinos into tennis. That is a completely different kind of impact. A player can win tournaments. A player can climb rankings. A player can collect trophies. But changing who watches a sport, who plays a sport, and who believes the sport belongs to them is something much bigger. That is what Eala appears to be doing. And Cincinnati became one of the clearest examples yet. The fans were traveling for her. One of the most revealing parts of the Cincinnati story had nothing to do with a forehand or backhand. It involved a group of college friends. These friends were now living in different parts of the United States. Their lives had moved in different directions. They were scattered across the country. Yet when they wanted to reunite, they chose Cincinnati. Not because Cincinnati was a traditional vacation destination. Not because of a beach. Not because of a major concert. They planned their college reunion around Alex Eala. Think about that for a moment. A group of friends who had not been living in the same place anymore looked at their calendars, looked at the tennis schedule, and decided that an Alex Eala match was worth bringing everyone together. That is not ordinary sports fandom. That is emotional attachment. And there was another story that might be even more difficult to believe. One fan had watched Eala in Toronto. Then, instead of simply waiting for the next tournament or watching from home, that supporter drove approximately 8 hours to Cincinnati. 8 hours. A flight would have been easier. Watching on television would have been cheaper. But the fan wanted to be there again. Wanted to see Eala play again. Wanted to experience the atmosphere again. That tells you something about the connection Eala has created with her supporters. For these fans, watching Alex Eala is not merely about watching a tennis match. It is an experience. The price went up, and the fans still came. There was another fascinating detail surrounding the Cincinnati crowds. Tickets were not exactly cheap. Packages that had previously been available at lower prices were now being listed for significantly more, with reports of prices rising from around $275 to approximately $470. That is a dramatic increase. Yet people were still buying. They were willing to spend hundreds of dollars. They were willing to drive hundreds of miles. They were willing to rearrange work schedules. They were willing to organize reunions. And they were willing to wait. All for Alex. This is why describing the Eala effect simply as popularity doesn't really capture what is happening. Popularity suggests people recognize a player. This is different. Eala has created participation. Her supporters feel personally connected to her success. They do not simply watch her. They identify with her. And when she walks onto the court carrying the Philippine flag in one form or another, thousands of people feel that she represents them. The dinosaur fan became part of the lore. If there is one image that perfectly captures the personality of Eala's supporters, it may be the infamous inflatable dinosaur. During the Canadian Open in Toronto, one fan appeared in the stands wearing an inflatable blue dinosaur costume with a Philippine flag draped over it like a cape. He danced. He celebrated. He put his leg on the railing. He shook with excitement. And, most importantly, Eala noticed him. The player herself later remembered the fan and described him enthusiastically. That moment became part of the growing mythology surrounding her supporters. The fan was not simply sitting quietly in the crowd. He was performing. He was having fun. He was creating a memory. And Eala appreciated it. She had already referred to the fan as a legend during the Canadian Open, and by Cincinnati, the story was still being remembered. That is important because it shows another side of the Eala effect. The fans are not simply spectators. They are characters in the story. They bring their own creativity, their own humor, their own traditions, their own energy. And Eala responds to it. The relationship goes both ways. Filipino fans even created their own tennis language. The creativity did not stop with costumes. Eala's supporters have developed their own vocabulary around her tennis. One of the most playful examples is the nickname given to her serve. Because Eala's service motion has sometimes been described as unconventional, Filipino supporters turned it into a joke and created their own slang for it. Instead of treating an unusual-looking motion as something negative, they transformed it into part of Eala's identity. That is classic fan culture. They take something specific to their favorite player and turn it into an inside joke. Soon, the joke becomes recognizable outside the original community. Tennis reporter Blair Henley discussed the phenomenon alongside former Grand Slam champion Kim Clijsters, explaining how Eala's supporters had embraced the unconventional nature of her serve. And Eala herself has learned to laugh along with them. That is another reason the connection feels authentic. She is not trying to control every part of the narrative. She is participating in it. Filipino humor has entered the WTA. There is another fascinating element to Eala's popularity. Her matches frequently take place at inconvenient hours for viewers in the Philippines. Because of the time difference between North America and the Philippines, many supporters are watching late at night or in the early morning. Instead of giving up, they stay awake. They find ways to keep themselves entertained. They create jokes. They create phrases. They create memes. They turn the experience into a shared cultural event. And that culture is now becoming visible on the WTA Tour. What started as Filipino fan humor is increasingly being noticed by international tennis audiences. That is how movements grow. First, a community creates something for itself. Then outsiders notice. Then the wider world begins talking about it. And suddenly, something that once existed inside a fan community becomes part of the sport's larger conversation. Even former champions have noticed the Eala effect has not gone unnoticed by tennis insiders. Former doubles world number 1 Renee Stubbs has spoken about the atmosphere surrounding Eala's matches and the way her supporters have changed the environment around the tournaments she plays. Stubbs acknowledged that some Filipino fans are relatively new to tennis and may not always understand traditional tennis etiquette. They might cheer at unusual moments. They might react loudly. They might treat points with the energy more commonly associated with basketball. But Stubbs did not frame that as a problem. Instead, she emphasized the excitement. And that distinction is critical. Tennis has spent decades trying to expand globally. Whenever the sport enters a new market, new audiences arrive with their own traditions and expectations. China experienced it. Other emerging tennis markets have experienced it. Now Filipino fans are bringing their own culture to the sport. And rather than suppressing that energy, the better question may be, what happens if tennis embraces it? Because the atmosphere surrounding Eala's matches is not something you can manufacture. You cannot simply buy advertising and create thousands of people who care deeply about a player. That kind of connection has to grow organically. And Eala has it. The most powerful compliment came from an opponent. Perhaps one of the most revealing moments came after Eala defeated an American player in front of a heavily pro-Eala crowd. Instead of complaining about the atmosphere, the player reportedly thanked Eala for allowing her to be part of the experience. Think about how unusual that is. She had just lost. The crowd was overwhelmingly supporting her opponent. Yet she recognized that something special had happened. That is the difference between an intimidating crowd and an unforgettable atmosphere. Players can hate losing, but they can still appreciate being part of something historic. Stubbs explained that even experienced players were beginning to recognize that playing Eala can feel like entering an atmosphere they have rarely experienced. She compared the energy to the kind of environment Serena Williams experienced during her biggest moments in New York. That comparison says everything. Serena did not simply have fans. She had an emotional ecosystem around her matches. Eala is beginning to create something similar. Not on the same historical scale yet. But the early signs are unmistakable. Amanda Anisimova knew what was coming. Then came Amanda Anisimova. World number 10. The American entered the Cincinnati matchup with an impressive resume. She had reached the Wimbledon and US Open finals in 2025. She had won major WTA 1000 titles. She had been a teenage prodigy. She had defeated some of the biggest names in the sport. On paper, this was an experienced, elite player facing a rapidly rising opponent. But Anisimova knew that the matchup would not be played in an ordinary atmosphere. She had seen the videos. She had heard the stories. And she had watched Eala's fan base grow. Before the match, Anisimova openly praised Eala's season and her fan base. She described Eala as a great player with a tremendous following and said she was looking forward to the atmosphere. That reaction was revealing. Anisimova was not complaining about the crowd. She was embracing it. She knew most of the fans would be supporting Eala. And she was ready for it. She even suggested that she would try to use the energy to motivate herself. That is the mindset of a top competitor. Instead of asking the crowd to be quieter, she wanted to thrive inside the chaos. And that chaos was coming. Naomi Osaka's basketball comparison makes sense. Anisimova also referenced a description that had previously been associated with Eala's matches. A basketball game. That comparison may sound strange when talking about tennis. But watch an Eala match with thousands of Filipino supporters in the stands, and suddenly, it makes sense. The crowd reacts to big points. They chant. They wave flags. They celebrate together. The noise rises and falls with the momentum. The atmosphere feels communal rather than individual. Traditional tennis crowds can be restrained. Eala's crowds are emotional. They are expressive. They are involved. For a player who is used to quiet concentration, that can be jarring. For Eala, it has become part of the experience. And that is why opponents have to mentally prepare before playing her. They are not simply preparing to face her forehand. They are preparing to face the environment surrounding her. Eala has already beaten elite players, of course. None of this would matter if Eala could not perform. Crowds can create attention. They cannot hit winners for you. They cannot serve for you. They cannot save break points. Eala has earned her position through results. During the 2026 season, she has already defeated several top 10 opponents, including Iga Swiatek, Elena Rybakina, Coco Gauff, and Jessica Pegula. That matters because it makes the fan phenomenon much more powerful. If Eala were simply a popular player struggling to win matches, the story would be different. Instead, she is combining popularity with genuine elite-level performance. She is winning. She is progressing. She is collecting major victories. And her fan base is growing alongside her. That is the dangerous combination for the rest of the tour. A player with a huge audience is valuable. A player with a huge audience who keeps winning is transformational. The Eala effect started long before Cincinnati was not the beginning. It was simply the moment when the phenomenon became impossible to ignore. Earlier in the season, Eala's supporters had already demonstrated their dedication. At Indian Wells, long lines formed well before one of her matches. Fans arrived carrying Philippine flags. Some wore shirts identifying themselves as members of the Alex Eala fan club. The match was delayed. The evening became colder. The start time moved later. Many spectators could have left. They did not. They stayed wrapped in coats and blankets. They waited. And they continued cheering. Afterward, Eala acknowledged how much that support meant to her. For a young player, seeing people remain in the cold simply to watch you compete is an emotional experience. It creates a bond. The fans sacrifice something for the player. The player then feels responsible for giving them something in return. That is how a sporting community forms. Jessica Pegula saw it firsthand. Jessica Pegula experienced the phenomenon during Eala's breakthrough period. Pegula was playing in Miami, where she had home support. Yet when she faced Eala, the crowd seemed to belong to the Filipina. Pegula later recalled looking around and wondering where all the people had come from. That question has become almost symbolic of the Eala effect. Where did they come from? The answer is everywhere. They come from the Philippines. They come from Filipino communities in the United States. They come from Canada. They come from Europe. They come from cities hundreds of miles away. They come from families who have never attended a professional tennis match before. They come because Eala gives them a reason to care. That is perhaps her greatest commercial and cultural strength. She is not merely converting existing tennis fans. She is creating new ones. A new generation could be watching. This is why ESPN's observation about young Filipinos may ultimately be more important than the ticket numbers. Imagine a child in the Philippines watching Eala defeat a top player. Imagine that child seeing thousands of Filipino flags in a stadium in the United States. Imagine that child realizing that someone from their country can compete against the world's best. Then imagine that child picking up a racket. That is how sporting legacies begin. Not with trophies. With identification. A young fan sees someone who looks like them, speaks their language, represents their country, and competes on the biggest stages. Suddenly, tennis feels accessible. It feels possible. It feels like something that belongs to them. Coco Gauff has recognized this impact, praising Eala for bringing a new demographic to the WTA and describing her as a positive role model. Stubbs made a similar prediction. She believes Eala can bring large numbers of young people into tennis. If that happens, Eala's influence could eventually be measured not simply in rankings or titles, but in participation. More Filipino junior players. More tennis academies. More tournaments. More fans. More sponsorship. More visibility. That is the true long-term potential of the Eala effect. The diaspora found a home. In tennis, there is also a deeper cultural dimension to this phenomenon. For Filipinos living abroad, identity can become complicated. They may live thousands of miles away from the Philippines. They may work in different industries. They may raise families in different countries. They may speak different languages depending on where they live. But when Alex Eala walks onto a tennis court, those differences temporarily disappear. The flags come out. The chants begin. The The community gathers. For a few hours, a stadium in Miami, Toronto, Cincinnati, London, or Melbourne can feel like a small piece of the Philippines. That is what makes the Eala effect more than a marketing story. It is a diaspora story. A sporting community is creating a sense of belonging wherever Eala plays. And Eala understands that relationship. She responds to her supporters. She acknowledges them. She uses Filipino expressions. She recognizes the sacrifices they make. The message is simple. The fans tell her, "You are not alone." And Eala tells them, "I see you." That reciprocal recognition is powerful. Eala is carrying more than a racket when Eala walks onto court now. She is carrying more than a tennis racket. She carries expectations. She carries the hopes of a country that has waited a long time for a tennis player capable of competing at the highest level. She carries the dreams of young Filipino players. She carries the pride of overseas Filipinos who finally have a sporting figure representing them on a global stage. And she carries the pressure that comes with becoming a symbol. Eala has admitted that the experience can sometimes feel heavy. There are moments when the attention is fun. There are moments when it is overwhelming. But she also understands that the attention exists because of the work she has already done. That is an important perspective. She knows the crowd is not guaranteed. She knows the attention can disappear. And she knows the only way to keep experiencing these moments is to continue improving as a player. That mindset may be one of the reasons the phenomenon continues to grow. She is not treating the fans as a replacement for performance. She understands that performance creates the platform. The Eala effect is bigger than Cincinnati. Cincinnati may have become the latest example, but the story is far from finished. The US Open is next. Then come more international events, more North American tournaments, more Asian events, more opportunities for Eala to bring her supporters together. And if her results continue improving, the crowds will likely grow with them. That creates an interesting challenge for the tennis establishment. What happens when a player who is still climbing the rankings becomes one of the biggest crowd attractions on tour? What happens when her matches consistently generate more emotional engagement than players ranked higher than her? What happens when sponsors realize that her audience is not just watching tennis, but actively participating in her journey? And what happens when thousands of young Filipinos decide to pick up a racket because they watched Alex Eala? Those questions are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The tennis world has a new problem. In the best possible way for decades, tennis has often been criticized for being too traditional, too quiet, too formal, too difficult for new audiences to connect with. Then a 21-year-old Filipina arrives with a fan base that treats tennis like a national celebration. The response should not be fear. It should be curiosity. The sport should ask what makes these fans so passionate. Why are they traveling? Why are they buying tickets? Why are they bringing their children? Why are they staying up at impossible hours? Why are they driving 8 hours between tournaments? Why are they organizing reunions around matches? And most importantly, how can tennis create more moments like this? Because the Eala effect proves something important. People still want to care deeply about sports. They want athletes who represent something. They want stories. They want identity. They want community. They want to feel that their presence matters. Eala gives them all of that. The crowd is part of the story. Now, when Amanda Anisimova stepped onto the court in Cincinnati, she was not entering an ordinary WTA 1000 match. She was entering an atmosphere, a sea of Philippine flags, a crowd that had traveled, a community that had waited, a fan base that had turned Alex Eala's journey into something personal. The dinosaur fan was part of the story. The college reunion group was part of the story. The 8-hour road trip was part of the story. The fans who paid hundreds of dollars were part of the story. The people watching from the Philippines in the middle of the night were part of the story. And Eala herself understood that. This was no longer just about one match. It was about what the match represented. A young woman from the Philippines standing on one of the biggest tennis stages in the world while thousands of people from her community shouted her name. That image would have been difficult to imagine only a short time ago. Now, it is becoming normal. And that is perhaps the most extraordinary part. This is only the beginning. The easiest mistake would be to look at the Eala effect as a temporary craze. A hot streak. a novelty, a group of fans enjoying a few successful months. But the evidence suggests something deeper is developing. The fans are organizing. The media is paying attention. Top players are talking about her. Former champions are discussing her influence. Tournament organizers are noticing the demand. ESPN is documenting the phenomenon. And young Filipinos are watching. That combination creates momentum. Momentum is difficult to stop. And Alex Eala is still only 21. Her career is just beginning. She has not yet reached her final ranking. She has not yet won every tournament she wants to win. She has not yet played every major stage. She has not yet experienced the full pressure that comes with becoming a global sports star. But if the trajectory continues, the Eala effect could become one of the most interesting stories in women's tennis. Because the story is not simply, Alex Eala is winning. The story is, Alex Eala is bringing people with her. And that changes everything. A movement, not just a fan base. The phrase fan base almost feels too small now. A fan base watches. A movement participates. A fan base buys merchandise. A movement travels. A fan base cheers. A movement organizes itself. A fan base follows results. A movement builds identity around them. That is what is happening with Eala. Her supporters have created traditions. They have created language. They have created viral moments. They have created an atmosphere that players recognize before stepping onto the court. And they have created something that tennis cannot manufacture from the top down. Authentic passion. That may ultimately be Eala's greatest contribution to the sport. Not a single trophy. Not a single ranking. Not a single match. But the thousands of people who discover tennis because they wanted to watch her. The future could be much bigger. Imagine what happens if Eala reaches the latter stages of a Grand Slam again. Imagine the Filipino flags surrounding the courts. Imagine the ticket demand. Imagine the international television audience. Imagine Filipino communities around the world organizing watch parties. Imagine children in Manila, Cebu, Davao, Los Angeles, Toronto, London, Dubai, and Singapore picking up rackets because they watched Eala compete. Imagine sponsors realizing that Eala's audience extends far beyond traditional tennis demographics. That is the opportunity. And it is why the tennis world should be paying attention. Because the Eala effect is not simply about one tournament. It is about what happens when an athlete becomes a bridge between sport and identity. Alex Eala gives Filipino fans a reason to gather. She gives young athletes a role model. She gives tournaments a new source of energy. And she gives tennis access to an audience that may not have been deeply connected to the sport before. That is an extraordinary combination. Cincinnati was the warning, so perhaps the biggest story from Cincinnati was never the result of one match. It was the crowd. It was the flags. It was the travel. It was the excitement. It was ESPN acknowledging what fans had already known. Alex Eala is becoming one of the biggest crowd magnets in tennis. And her supporters are not going anywhere. The 8-hour drive fan is only one example. The college reunion is only one example. The dinosaur costume is only one example. The late-night viewers in the Philippines are only one example. Together, they tell a much bigger story. A story about a country discovering a tennis hero. A diaspora finding a common symbol. A young generation finding someone to believe in. And a sport discovering an entirely new audience. That is the Eala effect. The question tennis must now answer. The question is no longer whether Alex Eala has a fan base. She clearly does. The question is how big this can become. Can she turn the energy surrounding her into sustained growth for tennis in the Philippines? Can her popularity translate into more young players entering academies? Can her success inspire tournaments and sponsors to invest more heavily in Filipino tennis? Can she become one of the defining global faces of women's tennis? And perhaps the most exciting question of all, what happens when Alex Eala starts winning even more? Because if this is what the crowds look like now, imagine what they will look like after another breakthrough. Imagine a deep US Open run. Imagine another WTA 1000 title. Imagine a Grand Slam semifinal. Imagine a Grand Slam final. The Eala effect would not simply grow. It could explode. and the tennis world would have to adapt. Alex Eala is just getting started. There is something beautifully simple at the heart of all of this. A young Filipina picked up a tennis racket. She worked. She traveled. She lost matches. She learned. She improved. She started beating players who were supposed to be better than her. And slowly, people back home began watching. Then, more people watched. Then, Filipinos living overseas started showing up. Then, entire communities started traveling. Then, stadiums started filling. Then, the players noticed. Then, the media noticed. And now ESPN is talking about it. That is how a movement begins. Not in a boardroom. Not with a marketing campaign. Not with a carefully designed slogan. It begins with people caring. And Filipinos care about Alex Eala. They care enough to drive 8 hours. They care enough to organize reunions. They care enough to spend hundreds of dollars. They care enough to stay awake through the night. They care enough to turn a tennis stadium into a sea of Philippine flags. And Alex Eala has given them something to believe in. So when she walks onto the court, she is not walking out alone. She carries a country with her. She carries a diaspora with her. She carries a generation of young fans with her. And now, increasingly, she carries the attention of the entire tennis world. The Eala effect is real. Cincinnati proved it. ESPN documented it. Her opponents have experienced it. Her fans have built it. And Alex Eala is only getting started. The next chapter will be written at the US Open. Then Asia. Then the rest of the world. The question is no longer whether tennis is ready for Alex Eala. The question is whether tennis is ready for everything that comes with her. Because the crowds are getting bigger. The stories are getting louder. The flags are everywhere. And the movement has already begun. Alex Eala is not simply bringing Filipino fans to tennis. She is showing the tennis world what happens when an entire community finally sees itself represented on the biggest stage. And once a community finds that voice, it becomes very difficult to silence. The Eala effect is here.